The carrier Akagi's steel deck vibrated beneath Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's boots as he watched the dawn of June 4th, 1942, paint the Pacific horizon in shades of crimson and gold. Somewhere beyond that deceptive serenity lay Midway Atoll, a speck of coral and sand that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed would draw the remaining American fleet into a final, decisive battle. The same man who had orchestrated the devastating surprise at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now commanded the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and dozens of supporting vessels, all converging on what seemed an insignificant patch of ocean. Fuchida adjusted his flight goggles and surveyed the organized chaos around him. Mechanics made final adjustments to Zero fighters while armorers loaded the deadly cargo of bombs and torpedoes. The air crackled with anticipation and the acrid smell of aviation fuel. These same flight decks had launched the attack that had brought America to its knees at Pearl Harbor, and now they prepared to deliver what many believed would be the knockout blow to American naval power in the Pacific. The strategy appeared flawless in its conception. Yamamoto's plan called for a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces northward, while his main force would seize Midway and establish an advanced base from which to threaten Hawaii itself. The Americans, he calculated, would be forced to respond with whatever remained of their Pacific fleet, allowing Japan's superior numbers and veteran pilots to crush them in a decisive engagement. What Fuchida and his fellow aviators did not know was that their enemy was already aware of their approach. Deep in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had been working around the clock to break the Japanese naval code. Their breakthrough had come weeks earlier, revealing not just the target, which the Japanese referred to in code as AF, but also the timing and composition of the attacking force. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters overlooking Pearl Harbor, faced a gambler's choice with the highest possible stakes. His intelligence told him exactly where and when the Japanese would strike, but his forces were dramatically outnumbered. The carrier Yorktown, heavily damaged in the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, sat in dry dock undergoing repairs that should have taken months. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with their escorts, represented virtually all that remained of America's Pacific naval strength. Context, referenced from Walter Lord's Incredible Victory and official U.S. Navy battle reports. As the Japanese fleet steamed eastward through the pre-dawn darkness, Yamamoto himself aboard the massive battleship Yamato, confidence ran high throughout the armada. The previous 6 months had seen an unbroken string of Japanese victories across the Pacific. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen before the rising sun. The Americans, they believed, lacked both the will and the capability to mount effective resistance against the Imperial Navy's might. But unknown to the approaching Japanese, 3 American carriers were already positioned northeast of Midway, their crews tense with the knowledge that the next few hours would likely determine the course of the Pacific War. The trap was set, the players moving into position for what would become the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar, fought not with broadsides and boarding parties, but with aircraft launched from floating airfields hundreds of miles apart. The morning sun climbed higher as Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force from the bridge of Akagi, gave the order that would set the battle in motion. At 6:30 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 108 bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes, lifted off from the 4 carriers and formed up for the attack on Midway. The roar of engines filled the air as Commander Joichi Tomonaga led his formations westward toward the tiny atoll that appeared as little more than a smudge on the vast Pacific. The American defenders on Midway had been expecting this moment. Radar operators had detected the incoming formations while they were still over 100 miles away. giving the island's meager air defenses precious time to prepare. Every flyable aircraft on the atoll, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, aging Wildcats, and even a handful of flying fortresses, scrambled to meet the threat. The island's anti-aircraft guns, manned by Marines who had been told they were the last line of defense, trained their barrels skyward. The clash over Midway was brutal and brief. The American fighters, outclassed and outnumbered, fought with desperate courage against the superior Japanese Zeros. Captain Marion Carl and his Marine pilots threw themselves against the enemy formations, knowing they were buying time for the island's defenses with their lives. Below them, bombs began falling on the airfield and installations as Tomonaga's bombers pressed home their attack through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Meanwhile, 150 miles to the northeast, the American carriers had launched their own strike against the Japanese fleet. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, flew directly toward what they knew would likely be their deaths. Waldron, a man of Lakota heritage who had risen through the ranks to command one of the Navy's elite squadrons, had studied the Japanese tactics and knew his obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers would be sitting ducks for the enemy fighters. As Tomonaga's bombers returned from their attack on Midway, they brought disturbing news to Admiral Nagumo. The island's airfield had been damaged but not destroyed, and American planes were still operational. More troubling was Tomonaga's radio message. There is need for a second attack wave. This single transmission would prove to be one of the most consequential communications in naval history, for it forced Nagumo into a series of decisions that would ultimately doom his fleet. On Midway itself, the damage was extensive but not crippling. The powerhouse that supplied electricity to the island had been destroyed, fuel tanks were ablaze, and several buildings lay in ruins. Yet the crucial runways remained operational, and the island's defenders were far from beaten. As Japanese bombs had fallen around them, Marines and Navy personnel had continued to man their posts, some fighting fires, while others prepared for what many believed would be an inevitable invasion. The first phase of the battle was drawing to a close, but neither side yet understood the full scope of what was about to unfold. Nagumo faced a critical decision. Should he launch an immediate second strike against Midway, or should he prepare his aircraft to engage the American fleet that his reconnaissance planes had not yet located? The choice he made in the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of the battle, but the future course of the war in the Pacific. The morning sun, now fully risen above the endless expanse of blue water, illuminated a scene of controlled chaos aboard both fleets. On the American carriers, air crews worked frantically to arm and fuel their aircraft for what they knew would be a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, wrestling with a decision that would echo through history. The morning attack on Midway had been successful but incomplete, and Commander Tomonaga's urgent message demanding a second strike weighed heavily on his mind. Yet Nagumo also knew that somewhere in the vast Pacific, American carriers were lurking, waiting to strike. The Japanese battle plan had anticipated finding and destroying these ships. But so far, his reconnaissance aircraft had found nothing but empty ocean. At 7:15 in the morning, Nagumo made his fateful choice. He ordered his aircraft to be rearmed for a second attack on Midway, switching from armor-piercing bombs designed for use against ships to high-explosive bombs meant for land targets. On the hangar decks below, ordnance crews began the laborious process of changing the weapons loads on dozens of aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes were moved about the crowded spaces, creating a deadly accumulation of explosives that would soon prove catastrophic. Just as this rearming process began, at 7:28, a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally reported what Nagumo had been dreading. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The sighting was vague and incomplete, but it changed everything. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming process halted and reversed. Now his aircraft would need to be prepared once again for naval combat with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. This constant changing of armaments created chaos aboard the Japanese carriers. Ordnance crews, working in cramped hangar spaces, found themselves surrounded by stacks of bombs and torpedoes as they tried to complete the complex process of rearming an entire strike force. The normal safety procedures that would have seen unused ordnance properly stowed were abandoned in the rush to prepare for battle. The stage was being set for disaster. While Nagumo hesitated and his crews struggled with the rearming process, American torpedo bombers were already approaching his fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 had found the Japanese carriers, and despite knowing they faced almost certain death, pressed home their attack. Flying their obsolete Douglas Devastators at wave-top height, they bore straight toward the enemy fleet through a hail of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. The slaughter was methodical and complete. One by one, Waldron's bombers were shot down by the superior Japanese fighters. Waldron himself died at the controls of his aircraft, his last radio transmission a defiant, "Watch those fighters!" as Zeros closed in for the kill. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one survived the attack, and its pilot, Ensign George Gay, found himself floating in the Pacific amid the wreckage of his squadron, the sole witness to his comrades' sacrifice. Context drawn from Ensign George Gay's first-hand account and official U.S. Navy action reports, the attack achieved nothing tactically. Not a single torpedo found its target, but it served a crucial strategic purpose. The Japanese fighters, having descended to sea level to massacre the torpedo bombers, were now out of position and low on fuel. The carriers' decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed, and their defensive formations had been disrupted by the need to maneuver away from the torpedo attack. More American torpedo squadrons followed, meeting the same fate as Waldron's men. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown pressed their attacks with equal courage and suffered similar casualties. The ocean around the Japanese fleet became littered with burning aircraft and floating debris, while rescue crews aboard the carriers worked frantically to fish Japanese pilots from the water. By 10:20 in the morning, Admiral Nagumo might have believed the worst was over. His fighters had decimated 3 American torpedo squadrons, and his own aircraft were finally ready for a coordinated strike against the American carriers. The decks of his 4 carriers were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, their engines warming up for launch. Victory seemed within his grasp, the American fleet apparently reduced to desperate piecemeal attacks by obsolete aircraft. But high above the Japanese fleet, unseen and undetected, American dive bombers were approaching from the southwest. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was about to be redeemed in the most decisive 5 minutes of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours. His fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and he knew that soon he would face the agonizing choice between continuing the search and ensuring his pilots could return safely to their carrier. At 10:22 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, that dilemma was resolved when his keen eyes spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward at high speed. The destroyer Arashi had been detached from the main fleet to hunt for the American submarine Nautilus, which had attempted an unsuccessful torpedo attack earlier that morning. Now, as it hurried to rejoin the fleet, Arashi unwittingly led McCluskey directly to his target. Following the destroyer's wake like a highway across the ocean, the American dive bombers soon found themselves positioned perfectly above Admiral Nagumo's carrier force. What McCluskey saw below him was a target beyond an aviator's wildest dreams. The 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft armed with bombs and topped off with fuel. The ships were completely vulnerable, their fighter cover having been drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks and now desperately trying to land and refuel. At 10:25, McCluskey rolled his Dauntless dive bomber into its attack dive, followed by his squadron mates. At the same moment, by sheer coincidence, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie was leading 17 bombers from Yorktown in an attack on a different section of the Japanese fleet. The two American formations, operating independently and without coordination, had achieved perfect timing in their assault on the enemy carriers. The next 5 minutes would be remembered as the most decisive period in the history of naval warfare. McCluskey's bombers screamed down toward Kaga and Akagi, their sirens wailing as they plummeted through the sky at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The Japanese ships, caught completely off guard, began frantic evasive maneuvers, but the massive carriers were too large and slow to avoid the diving bombers. Lieutenant Dick Best, one of McCluskey's most experienced pilots, had initially aimed for Kaga, but noticed that several other bombers were already targeting that carrier. In a split-second decision that would prove crucial, he shifted his aim to Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. His 1,000-pound bomb, released at 1,500 feet, penetrated the carrier's flight deck and exploded among the armed and fueled aircraft crowded in the hangar below. The explosion aboard Akagi was catastrophic. The bomb detonated among stacks of ordnance that had been removed from aircraft during the morning's frantic rearming process. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited and spread fires throughout the hangar spaces. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet was transformed into a floating inferno, her flight deck buckled and twisted by internal explosions. Kaga suffered an equally devastating fate. Multiple bomb hits turned her into a raging pyre, her own aircraft and ordnance feeding the flames that would eventually consume the ship. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding the carrier, initially tried to save his ship, but the fires proved impossible to control. The vessel that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor was now dying beneath the same Pacific skies she had helped darken with smoke 6 months earlier. Soryu, attacked by Leslie's bombers from Yorktown, met a similar doom. 3 direct hits in rapid succession penetrated her flight deck and ignited the same deadly combination of fuel and ordnance that was destroying her sister ships. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, realizing his ship was doomed, ordered his crew to abandon ship while he remained aboard to share his vessel's fate. In those 5 miraculous minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their experienced aircrew dead or dying, their irreplaceable aircraft destroyed. The cream of the Imperial Navy's aviation forces, veterans of Pearl Harbor and countless other victories, were gone forever. As smoke billowed from 3 of his 4 carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced the collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. From the bridge of the burning Akagi, he watched in stunned disbelief as fires consumed not just his ships, but Japan's hopes of decisive victory in the Pacific. The morning that had begun with such promise, a coordinated strike against American forces that would finally break their resistance, had devolved into catastrophe in a matter of minutes. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, approached Nagumo with urgent reports from the damage control parties. The fires were spreading faster than they could be contained, and the ship's magazines were in danger of exploding. "Sir," Aoki said quietly, "we must transfer your flag to another ship." The decision to abandon his flagship was perhaps the most painful moment of Nagumo's naval career. But he knew his duty lay with the surviving elements of his fleet. As Nagumo transferred to the cruiser Nagara, 1 Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, had been positioned separately from the other 3 carriers and had escaped the devastating American attack. Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most aggressive and capable naval officers, was determined to strike back at the Americans, even as his 3 sister ships burned around him. At 10:54 in the morning, Hiryu launched her first counterstrike. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters under the command of Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, flew eastward with revenge burning in their hearts. Their target was the American carrier force that had just delivered such a crushing blow to their fleet. The American carriers, having launched their successful strikes, were now vulnerable in their own right. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 from the carrier Yorktown, knew that Japanese retaliation was inevitable. His ship, hastily repaired after damage suffered in the Coral Sea battle, was the most exposed of the 3 American carriers, having remained behind to recover her returning aircraft while Enterprise and Hornet retired to the east. At 12:10 in the afternoon, Yorktown's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike. The carrier's fighter director, Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson, scrambled every available Wildcat to intercept the attackers. The sky above the American task force erupted in aerial combat as Japanese dive bombers attempted to fight their way through the defensive screen of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese attacked with the skill and determination that had made them masters of the Pacific for 6 months. Despite heavy losses to American fighters, several of Kobayashi's bombers broke through the defensive screen. At 12:12, the first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating to the hangar level and starting fires among parked aircraft. 2 more bombs followed in quick succession, causing significant damage to the carrier's superstructure and communications systems. Details drawn from Admiral Chester Nimitz's official battle report and Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson's after-action account, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding Yorktown, proved that American damage control skills had improved dramatically since Pearl Harbor. His crew fought the fires with practiced efficiency, and within an hour the carrier was steaming at 20 knots and recovering aircraft. What the Japanese pilots reported as a sinking carrier was very much alive and dangerous. But Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. Tominaga, flying an aircraft damaged in the earlier mission, was determined to press home this final assault even though he lacked the fuel to return to his carrier. The second Japanese attack achieved what the first had not. Despite the desperate efforts of Yorktown's defenders, 2 torpedoes struck the carrier on her port side, flooding her engine spaces and bringing her to a dead stop. This time, Captain Buckmaster was forced to order his crew to abandon ship, believing his vessel was doomed. Yet even as Yorktown listed heavily in the calm Pacific swells, her sacrifice had not been in vain. The counterstrikes from Hiryu had cost the Japanese their remaining experienced pilots and aircraft. Admiral Yamaguchi now faced the same situation that had confronted Nagumo hours earlier. His carrier was alone and vulnerable, with most of his air group gone. The Americans were about to demonstrate that they too could deliver a devastating counterpunch. As the sun reached its zenith over the Pacific battlefield, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the carrier Enterprise faced a commander's ultimate test. With Yorktown apparently sinking and his own forces scattered after the morning's attacks, he possessed incomplete information about the enemy's remaining strength. Intelligence reports suggested that only 1 Japanese carrier remained operational, but Spruance knew that a single enemy flat top with experienced pilots could still inflict devastating damage on his fleet. The decision to launch another strike was complicated by fuel considerations and the scattered nature of his available aircraft. Many of his dive bombers were still returning from the morning attack, their pilots exhausted and their fuel tanks nearly empty. Yet Spruance understood that hesitation now could allow the surviving Japanese forces to regroup and potentially snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from Enterprise toward the last known position of the Japanese fleet. These pilots, like their morning predecessors, flew with the knowledge that they were potentially making a one-way trip. Fuel calculations showed they would barely have enough gas to return to their carrier, assuming they could find it again in the vast Pacific. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carrier Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi prepared for what he knew would likely be his final battle. The counterstrikes against Yorktown had cost him most of his remaining aircraft and pilots. His flight deck held only a handful of operational planes, and his fuel supplies were running dangerously low. Yet the Bushido Code that governed Japanese naval thinking demanded that he fight to the end, regardless of the odds. Captain Tomeo Kaku, commanding Hiryu, reported to Yamaguchi that his damage control teams had cleared the flight deck of debris from the earlier American attacks and were prepared to launch whatever aircraft remained. The admiral nodded grimly, knowing that each plane that took off would likely be the last flight for its pilot. The mathematics of aerial warfare had turned decisively against Japan, but honor demanded that they continue fighting. At 5:03 in the afternoon, Gallagher's dive bombers found their target. Hiryu sailed alone in the afternoon sun. Her escorts formed in a defensive circle around her, but powerless to prevent what was about to happen. The Japanese fighters that might have intercepted the American attack were either shot down during the earlier missions or lacked the fuel to reach effective altitude. The attack on Hiryu was swift and merciless. 4 direct hits in rapid succession turned the last operational Japanese carrier into another funeral pyre. The bombs penetrated her flight deck and exploded among the aviation gasoline and ordnance stored in her hangar spaces, creating the same catastrophic fires that had consumed her 3 sister ships earlier in the day. Admiral Yamaguchi, watching his flagship die around him, made a decision that epitomized the Japanese military code. Rather than abandon ship and live with the shame of defeat, he chose to remain aboard Hiryu and share her fate. Captain Kaku made the same choice, and together they stood on the bridge as fires consumed their vessel. Their final radio message to the fleet was brief and stoic. "We are proceeding to ram enemy carriers." The ramming attack never materialized. Hiryu's engines failed as fires reached her machinery spaces, leaving her dead in the water. By evening, she was a blazing wreck, her magazines exploding periodically and sending columns of flame and debris high into the darkening sky. The last of Japan's Pearl Harbor carriers was dying, taking with her the dreams of Pacific conquest that had seemed so achievable just 12 hours earlier. Account based on Japanese naval records translated during post-war interrogations of surviving officers, as night fell on June 4, 1942, the magnitude of Japan's defeat became clear. 4 fleet carriers, representing the heart of the Imperial Navy's striking power, were sunk or sinking. More critically, hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew, the product of years of intensive training and combat experience, were gone forever. These men could not be quickly replaced, and their loss would cripple Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. The Americans had paid a price as well. Yorktown appeared to be sinking, and dozens of aircraft and aircrew had been lost in the day's fighting. Yet their losses were sustainable, while Japan's were catastrophic. The industrial might of the United States would replace the lost aircraft within months, and new pilots were already training to replace those who had died. For Japan, with her limited industrial capacity and smaller population, such losses were irreplaceable. The morning of June 5, 1942, revealed the full scope of the transformation that had occurred beneath Midway's smoke-filled skies. Where the previous day had seen 4 proud Japanese carriers steaming confidently toward what they believed would be a decisive victory, now only oil slicks and floating debris marked their graves. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had all succumbed to their wounds during the night, taking with them Japan's hopes of dominating the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from his flagship Yamato, faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished career. The architect of Pearl Harbor had gambled everything on a single decisive battle, and he had lost catastrophically. His carrier striking force was destroyed, his invasion plans were in ruins, and the American fleet remained largely intact. The logical course was to retreat and preserve what remained of his forces for future operations. Yet retreat did not come easily to a man who had spent his entire career preparing for this moment. Yamamoto had convinced the Imperial High Command to approve the Midway operation by promising that it would finally bring the Americans to decisive battle. Now, with that battle fought and lost, he struggled with the implications of failure. The combined fleet still possessed powerful battleships and cruisers, but without air cover, these surface vessels were vulnerable to American air attack. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, Yamamoto transmitted the order that officially ended Japan's Pacific offensive. The Midway operation is canceled. The message, sent in code to his scattered forces, represented more than a tactical withdrawal. It marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific, a defensive campaign that would ultimately lead to the home islands themselves. The Americans, meanwhile, were discovering that their victory was even more complete than they had dared hope. Search planes launched at dawn found only burning wrecks and empty ocean where the mighty Japanese fleet had sailed the day before. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew had performed miracles of damage control, and the supposedly doomed Yorktown was still afloat, listing but stable. Salvage operations were already underway to save the wounded carrier. Admiral Spruance, now in tactical command of the American forces, faced his own strategic decisions. Intelligence reports suggested that powerful Japanese surface forces were still approaching Midway, and he had to balance the opportunity to inflict further damage against the risk of losing his remaining carriers to a night surface action. His decision to retire eastward, maintaining contact with the enemy while avoiding a decisive surface engagement, demonstrated the tactical wisdom that would make him one of America's finest naval commanders. The human cost of the battle was staggering, particularly for the Japanese. Of the approximately 2,700 officers and men who had sailed on the four carriers, fewer than 800 survived. Entire squadrons of experienced pilots, men who had trained for years and fought in campaigns across the Pacific, were gone forever. Flight Petty Officer Kyoto Furuta, one of the few survivors from Hiryu, would later write, "We had lost not just our ships, but the soul of our naval aviation." Quote taken from post-war interviews conducted by U.S. Naval Intelligence with Japanese survivors. For the United States, Midway represented the turning point that transformed America from a nation reeling from Pearl Harbor into the dominant naval power in the Pacific. The victory validated the intelligence work of Commander Joseph Rochefort's team, vindicated Admiral Nimitz's risky strategy, and proved that American industrial might, properly directed, could overcome even the most experienced enemy forces. The battle's strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's carrier-based aviation never recovered from the losses suffered at Midway. Future Japanese operations would be increasingly defensive in nature, lacking the offensive striking power that had characterized the first 6 months of the Pacific War. The initiative had passed permanently to the United States. As the surviving ships of both fleets retired from the battlefield, they left behind more than just wreckage and casualties. The old Pacific order, dominated by Japanese naval power, was ending. In its place, a new era was dawning, one in which American industrial capacity and fighting spirit would drive inexorably westward, island by island, toward the Japanese home islands themselves. The smoke-filled skies above Midway had witnessed not just a battle, but the birth of American Pacific supremacy that would endure for generations to come. The echo of that June morning would resonate through history, a reminder that in warfare, as in life, fortune often favors not the strongest or most experienced, but those who combine courage with wisdom, sacrifice with strategy, and determination with the will to prevail against overwhelming odds.